I told several of you as I came in this morning that for some reason I was especially nervous this morning, but the kids just told me that I have an Friend in Jesus, so that helped a lot. Would you join me in prayer? May the words of my mouth and the meditation of each of our hearts be acceptable and pleasing in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, as I read this scripture lesson from John's Gospel for this morning's message, I couldn't help but think about 4 little trees that I have been watering and encouraging during all of this spring and summer season. Sometime this spring, these little saplings arrived in the mail, I guess a free gift for something. We needed to plant them within just a few hours of their arrival, the directions told us, and so they found homes in our yard. What I love about this passage for this morning are the words of Jesus at the very beginning. Abide in me as I abide in you. He likens abiding to the relationship of the vulnerable, dependent branch with a stronger, more central vine of the plant. The branch stays always close to the vine, connected and receptive. The vine shares its life-giving nourishment with the branch. And the two live in a kind of co-creative relationship. And someday, after silently and patiently abiding in each other, resting in each other for a season or perhaps 2 or 3, the branch will bear its beautiful fruit. In the case of my little trees, hopefully that fruit will be dogwood blossoms, red buds, and my favorite, lilacs. We've come this week to the last practice of the spiritual journey described by Brian McLaren in his book, Naked Spirituality. And unlike the 11 practices that precede it, this final one has no buzzword, as Tom explained, because it's about silence with God. It's about simply being still or abiding, as the scripture said, in Jesus' presence, which of course is God's presence, and God's abiding in us as well, like the branch and the vine abide in each other. It's coming before God with an empty slate, no thoughts or words at all, no prayers of thanksgiving or confession, no asking for help for ourselves or others, and no questions about when will my prayers be answered, or why not are my prayers answered. It's just coming naked without any agenda before God, being nourished by those moments of silence with God, listening for God's heartbeat, knowing God's presence and finding pure joy in it. And it's finding space in that silence for our creation together with God of something that is beautiful and something that is new. Brian McLaren admits that at first he didn't get it, what he names contemplation, this kind of silent prayer. Coming in silence before God felt to him like doing nothing in the midst of the frenetic urgency of his busy life. It felt to him like wasting time, when his goals as a writer, preacher, and theologian were to save souls, preach sermons, solve problems, and yes, even transform the world in which he lived. I have to admit, I can't say that my goals are always quite that lofty, but I too have found this spiritual practice of silence, coming before God with an open slate, difficult at best. The world keeps pulling me back to my own identity, back to my own pressing issues. There are people to see, things to remember to do, opinions to ponder and shape about this or that. Thoughts swirl around in my head all the time, don't they in yours? Wipe my mind slate clean, erase it all for a time. I try, and sometimes I've made a little progress, but it's tough to do. And I think one of the points is I give up way too easily. I'm not sure why I never developed the practice of abiding in silence in God's presence, for it was modeled for me over a long period of time in my sister Penny's life. My message this morning about sharing silence with God is really a story, a part of her story, that I take joy in sharing with you, my church family. Penny suffered a neurological episode at the age of 8, which left her extremely physically limited. After she underwent over a year of physical rehabilitation, my parents were advised to put emphasis instead on her cognitive development, for she would function in a wheelchair for the rest of her life with very limited use of only her right hand and some of her arm. Her mind would be her strength, they said. My parents followed that advice. Penny graduated as valedictorian of her senior class and went on to earn bachelor's and master's degrees in mathematics. Math wasn't Penny's first choice, but in the late 1950s, at the college she attended, the math classes were the ones that were accessible to her in her wheelchair. After college, Penny landed a job as a computer programmer. Not particularly satisfying work for her, but her regular paycheck was a step toward independence. Increasingly, as my parents got older and somewhat physically limited themselves, and my brother and I got very involved with our busy jobs and lives, Penny was concerned about her future and how her physical care would be provided. The idea of institutional care was abhorrent to her, and so achieving independence from her family became an important goal. When Penny was in her early 30s, she was attracted to Christianity, initially by faith healing services that she saw on television. Over time, she became active in a Pentecostal Christian church and began her spiritual journey. At one point, she quit her job and enrolled in a religious college all the way across the country in California, with only very sketchy plans in place for her living and physical care there. When that finally failed, Penny came to live here with us for a time in Battle Creek. It was when she lived here that she committed to writing what she described as a vision that she had had some years before. In this vision, she was in charge of a community of able-bodied and physically limited children and adults living together in a God-centered family atmosphere on a large estate. I had little idea of what the vision meant, Penny wrote, except that God wanted to use me to minister to people who were hurting as I was hurting and who were seeking answers even in the midst of their suffering. Penny called it the Haven Fellowship, after some verses from Psalm 107 that refer to God stilling the storm and guiding distressed people to their desired haven. Penny was excited about the idea of ministry through people who were physically limited because she saw that often they are the very ones to whom God has given the precious gift of understanding the importance of people and their relationships. And in our hurry-scurry world, she wrote, they are often the ones who have more time to get to know God intimately. It was during the 5-year period when Penny lived here in Battle Creek that she modeled for me many of the spiritual practices that Brian McLaren describes in his book. Hear, thanks, oh. Sorry, help, please. Why? No, when? Those are backwards. And finally, behold, yes, and especially silence. What gave rise to Penny's prayer life? Well, in part, it surely was this. Penny had a right hand that could indeed do some things. Type slowly with one finger on a keyboard. Feed herself food that had been prepared and cut up for her. Turn the pages of a book slowly. And operate her wheelchair joystick that ran her power chair, sometimes even with fairly good control. But for virtually everything else, Penny needed pretty complete help. And oftentimes she had to wait for a caregiver to arrive to help her, or in the case of live-in caregivers, to finish one job so that they could get to her to do something for her. So she had lots of time on her hands, time that Penny chose to spend in prayer. Sometimes, I think often, just being still and abiding in God. When she prayed, I sometimes noticed that Penny seemed to be crying. And when I'd ask her later about that, she'd say something like, "I'm not sad. Knowing that God is here with me just brings those tears to my eyes. I think they're tears of joy." Anyone who knew Penny very well would surely say about her that she prayed without ceasing. After 5 years of living with us, Penny left Battle Creek for Virginia Beach, where she sensed the Haven Fellowship building and ministry were to be built, and where she started seminary study to prepare herself for a leadership role in her vision. The Haven was always on her mind. She'd share that vision with anyone who would listen. And she lived each day trusting that God would provide the building, the funds, people who needed and wanted help, able-bodied people to provide physical care and help with earning her seminary degree. And Penny prayed without ceasing. Several years later, Penny used most of the money she had saved from her job in programming to purchase a house in Virginia Beach, which she saw as taking a step of faith toward the fulfillment of the Haven Fellowship. It wasn't a large estate, just 3 small bedrooms, but it was a humble, faithful beginning. Needless to say, her family, myself included, thought Penny was absolutely crazy to be taking on the responsibilities of owning her own house. Along the way, Penny had many acquaintances and many different caregivers, people who would come into her life for a time and then move on. 3 in particular come to my mind. One was Gretchen, whom Penny met in Battle Creek. Gretchen had cerebral palsy and great difficulty with appropriate social skills. She and Penny shared a lot together and developed a close friendship, in part because Gretchen just could not trust able-bodied people. Able-bodied people were the ones who had the power to control her life. But she could trust Penny. Missy came into Penny's life in Virginia Beach. Missy was emotionally needed. She had been mistreated by men a number of times in her life. She needed a place to live and a job. And for several years, she and Penny were housemates and friends, Missy providing Penny's physical care, Penny providing emotional support in a home for Missy. Later, Penny met Jim, a young man with serious emotional, sometimes bordering on psychiatric problems. But he was a wonderful cook, and Penny paid Jim to come over several nights a week to cook her a wonderful dinner. And after dinner, they talked and talked, often well into the evening. My family responded to Penny's life choices in a variety of ways. We worried. We feared for her safety. We offered alternative suggestions. We begged her to come to her senses. We judged, we criticized, and sometimes we wisely kept our opinions to ourselves. And while there were occasionally rough spots, sometimes some pretty serious hardships, year after year for 25 years, Penny somehow managed to live in Virginia Beach without having to depend completely on her family, just as she had hoped and prayed would be possible. After my parents died, I was the one Penny called most often, especially when things weren't going too well. She didn't talk very much about it, but I knew as time went on that the details for the Haven Fellowship weren't all falling into place. When she called me, I'd give her my judgment about her current problem situation, along, I'm afraid, with abundant advice. And then sometimes I'd notice there was silence on the other end of the line. You see, God and Penny often spent time together in silence, and sometimes what comes out of that relationship is impossible to put into words that anyone who wasn't there with them can understand. And so in response to all my words and advice, sometimes Penny just kept silence. There came a time when I called Penny one night because she'd had a bad flu for several days and I wanted to check on her. She was so discouraged. Apparently, her right hand, her physical lifeline, had failed her. She had told me the previous Christmas, just several months before this, that sometimes she wasn't able to control that hand as well as she used to. This night, she had been unable to stop her wheelchair's joystick to keep her chair from becoming wedged tightly under the desk. She was absolutely stuck there. She was so worn out and tired from having been sick that she just wanted to get to bed. But she had tried calling her caregiver from the phone, using the phone that she wore all the time, and he couldn't get to the house for another several hours. He lived all the way across Norfolk, a long way away, and didn't usually come until later in the evening. The only hint of good news that Penny told me that night was that she thought she might be up to eating some breakfast in the morning. But there was nothing to do now but wait. We talked some more, and I finally hung up the phone, feeling so helpless. But there's absolutely no doubt in my mind how she spent those next few waiting hours. As tired and worn out as she was, I know she was being still, silent, abiding in God, as she so often did. Of course, I have no way of knowing for sure what actually happened that night after I hung up the phone, but I've imagined it so many times since then. I wonder if Penny's silence with God might have left space for her to see her vision of the Haven Fellowship in a new light, as a new creation. She could probably see it better with God's consciousness intermingled with her own. The Haven Fellowship was their dual creation. No large estate, but a house, a home. No copious financial resources, but just enough. No long-term committed helpers, but Penny, reaching out to those who came to her with their struggles and their pain. And Penny's credentials? Well, she had earned her seminary degree by that time, but Penny had known all along how to counsel and comfort those who were hurting, with the same counsel and comfort that God had given her throughout her life of prayer. Somehow, I imagine in the silence that night, Penny saw that her home, her life, and the people who had moved through her life, and her gifts, all created with God's help, were the Haven Fellowship. The next morning after her shower, her caregiver left Penny for just a moment, all bundled up in towels in her bedroom, to go and put on some hot water for the egg that she had indeed requested for breakfast. But while he was gone, Penny passed away alone in her bedroom. Well, no, not really alone. This chapter about silence from naked spirituality makes me more committed to working toward this being still in silence with God that has sometimes seemed so elusive to me. It takes practice, and it takes discipline to be willing to devote the time to it. I know I can find that time if I just look at the time I spend playing computer games and doing lots of other things. In fact, we all can. And it's worth it to me. What will come of it is Jesus' nourishment for my spirit seeping through the vine. What will come of it is God's abiding in me and the effects of that divine indwelling on changing me, how I see things, and how I live my life. When I'm not dictating the agenda in prayer to God with words, what will come of our silence together is God's writing on my empty slate and inviting me to join in writing too, becoming a partner with God in the creative process. And what may come of that, our being still and creating together in the silent space, will be something beautiful and something new, something that always comes wrapped up in love. Perhaps a new song for me to sing. Perhaps an insight for how to contribute meaningfully to the solution for a societal problem that deeply troubles me. Perhaps divine inspiration for the story I've been struggling to write for a very long time. A stunning lilac blossom, beautiful to the senses, emerging from the vine and the branch, abiding together. On that long night spent in the silence with God, I suspect Penny sang a New Haven Fellowship song, and the next day, I imagine she danced to it. Just one more thing. At the end of his words, in our passage from John's Gospel, Jesus says this, "I have said these things to you so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete." That kind of joy that is born of our abiding in God and God's abiding in us in silence, that kind of joy is all-consuming. It leaves no room left over in us for fear or guilt, hatred or intolerance, or anything that separates us from each other or from God. I long to live that way, don't you? Amen.